comes the rain. With my anger comes a tide of emotion, killing joy, cutting steel across your eyes.
Hi, this is Brendan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock blog, and I'm here with Jeremy Bai for another episode of Righteous Blood Podcast, where we talk about Wuxia movies and Wuxia books and the game that we've been working on, Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, which should hopefully be out in October. We're thinking, but we don't know for sure. And yeah, so today we're going to be doing Bride with White Hair 1 and 2. We thought that especially the first movie was somewhat influential in the book, but also just the style of film that it is, we thought made it worthy of talking about on the program. And we both had somewhat different reactions to the movie and to its sequel, and so we're going to talk about that as well, because I think that'll get into some of our different preferences that were important when we were working on the book and working on the game. So Jeremy, why don't you usher in the first movie, and we'll have a little discussion about that and then get into some of our themes.
Sure. So, I mean, I don't think you mentioned it's based on a pretty popular book, and there are other adaptations as well. Like there's a TV series and whatnot, but I think this is the most quintessential one, and it's definitely much darker, which is I think one of the reasons we picked it. Matches the theme of the game that we were aiming for, and it's a 90s movie that I watched many years ago when I was first getting into the Wuxia stuff. And interestingly enough, in contrast to One-Armed Swordsman, which we did last time, when we talked about One-Armed Swordsman, I said that I didn't like it when I originally watched it. I liked it more this time. For Bride with White Hair, it was like the opposite. I remember liking it a lot more back in the day when I first saw it. Mm-hmm. And this time, for whatever reason, I didn't like it as much. Now, that's not to say I hated it or something. There's definitely a lot of really cool stuff, really relevant stuff for the game, and just stuff that I liked in general. But overall, for some reason, I was not digging it as much this time.
Yeah, and I remember I got into it through, I remember picking up at Blockbuster back when there were Blockbusters, and that was my first encounter with it. And I do remember years later I came back to it, like around 2012 or something, I came back to it, kind of like you are now. And I had a slightly different reaction to it, but I still really liked it a lot. But I'm curious what... And the big reaction is I remembered it being way more erotic than it was, because it's like it's like emblazoned on the cover, and it's kind of, that's sort of how it's known, and that had grown in my memory. And then when I watched it, I was like, this is fairly tame. You know, they probably shouldn't be saying this is an erotic masterpiece on the cover. But I'm curious what it was that you found was different when you went back to it, because I've noticed that too with a lot of these movies. Even if it's just a 4 or 5 year difference, sometimes I've had quite a different reaction because my head's in a different place, or I've seen so many more movies that I judge them differently now.
Well, one thing was that the scene you're talking about. So there's a scene where they're like in the cave, water and stuff like that. And, you know, to be honest, that never made much of an impression on me. At least I remember that scene happening, but I never thought too much of it. I'm guessing that when I probably watched this movie, I was probably in my 20s, I think, which that's when I kind of started to get into Wuxia. But this time it was like, that was one of the big turnoff scenes for me. It was just, I think, like if I was going to describe it, I would say it makes me think of something that like a couple middle school film students would make as a love scene in like a PG-13 like teeny bopper movie or something. It's just so, it was so cringeworthy to me. They're kind of just like rubbed up against each other, sort of. I know there's some about how that scene came to be, but in the end, I was like, just fast forward.
Here's how I will describe the scene, because I have paid close attention to it after your reaction. So number one, it looks like a lot of early 90s love scenes, which are almost kind of montagey and impressionistic, right? Like they don't, do you know what I mean? Like late 80s, early 90s lovemaking scenes are kind of they're sort of painted with this really weird brush, and they're very hand wavy about how lovemaking actually happens. Do you know what I mean? So it doesn't look anything like real romance between people. And the way that this scene is edited is kind of strange, because they have sequences where they're sort of holding each other in an embrace and talking, and those scenes make total sense. But then they intercut them with these montagey, impressionistic scenes that are definitely not how these kind of scenes are done anymore. And it aged. I will say that it aged a certain way. It doesn't bother me as much as it bothered you, but I can understand the reaction to it, because it's not how somebody would do it now, and it's not the style that took hold, I think, and so it just kind of looks odd. But go ahead.
I wouldn't say that was like necessarily something that killed the movie for me per se. It was just, that was kind of like something that jumped out to me as being odd. I often talk about language stuff when we talk about these movies. Yeah. I'm not going to go into any detail about that, because that's not really the point of what we're talking about. But that also played a little bit into my reasons for kind of not liking it as much. It's always different when you're watching it and you don't understand what they're saying, mm-hmm. and you do. It's something I've come to find, obviously, after learning Chinese. So that had something to do with it as well.
Now, are you learning that some of the dialogue in the movies isn't as good as you thought it was, or it just is different and therefore changes how you feel about it?
It's a lot of it is because it's, well, you pick up a lot more when you understand what they're actually saying. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times the subtitles, they leave things out. One thing I've come to realize over the years, and I've thought about doing a video about this on my own, because I do videos on YouTube about this kind of thing. I just realized how poorly the names and titles are translated. And I know so many people learn about the wuxia genre by watching the movies, but there's just such a big disconnect between how they translate the names, whether it's subtitles or dubbing, either one. It's just usually completely different from the Chinese. And so I think that's a major aspect of the entire genre that doesn't come across to people who don't understand the language. And then now that I do understand the language, it doesn't like offend me or something, but I kind of think, man, I really wish that audiences who are doing subs or dubs had a better rendition of the dialogue, basically. But
I guess what I'm wondering, though, is because you're saying it actually changed your impression of the movie, and I've heard you say this about other films too. And so, because I remember you mentioned it about Heroes of the East, I think, when we did that one. What I'm wondering is, I mean, that's more a critique of the dialogue, or not the dialogue, the subtitles. But does it actually does hearing this movie in the original language somehow more negatively, like you react more negatively to the movie because you're seeing it more clearly than before? Do you know what I mean?
I totally know what you mean. And I think in this case, it wasn't like that. In this case, I feel like in terms of the tone and whatnot, I think everything pretty much did come across.
Okay.
So in this case, yeah. The other thing that turned me off to this one, I don't want to harp on the negative aspects too much, was the villain really didn't click with me this time around. And I understand where they were like aiming for with the villain, but it was like, and I understand that Chinese cinema is a lot more over the top a lot of the times, but this one for me went over the top. It was just like in terms of the way that they acted. I say they because the villain is a I mean, we're in spoiler realm here, so if anybody hasn't watched the movie, they should probably pause, go watch it, and then come back and listen. But the conjoined twin villains just didn't work for me in terms of their story, in terms of how the girl was like constantly just bursting out into piercing laughter. I mean, it's a genre trope, I get it, but it could be that day I was like really tired, so maybe I just didn't have the patience for it. But in the end, I just wasn't super thrilled with the way they handled the villain.
Okay. No, and I like the villain. I had an opposite reaction, but again, it's just, a subjective thing. And I think that it's definitely, how can I put it? It's an intense characterization of the character. So if it's not going to land well with you, it's going to not land well kind of hard. Do you know what I mean? So I definitely get that. We probably should mention did we mention the plot elements already, or did we kind of gloss over that?
We kind of glossed over, so maybe we should. Maybe you can give a little summary.
So I mean, it's basically they take the original novel and they pretty much chuck most of it out the window. Like and the director was intentionally trying to make this more of like a star-crossed lover type, Romeo and Juliet type thing. There's stuff like that in the original book, but it just the book it reads much differently than this movie, is told. And I've seen other movies that are more true to the book, but they don't have the same level of emotional resonance, I've found. Whether that's because nobody's nailed it yet or what, I don't know, or if the book's just hard to render into movie. But I like this particular version. And it's basically, she comes from the evil clan, he comes from Wudang, which is like an orthodox clan, and she leaves her sect and suffers really bad consequences for leaving the sect. And through a misunderstanding, she comes to believe that he doesn't trust her anymore and that he's betrayed her, and they end up as enemies and her hair turns white and there's a big battle. I'm not going into the nitty-gritty of the details, but that's the big broad brush strokes. I don't know if there's anything that you want to add to it.
No, I think that pretty much hits all the beats.
And I will assure people there are a lot more plot details in there, and it's and you kind of get into sort of the internal workings of Wudang, and you get to see this really interesting evil cult that, I don't know, I haven't seen too many things like this in Wuxia. I've seen them in TV shows and stuff, but not in as many Wuxia movies, where they really kind of go into, I don't know, they take the magic pretty far, I think, with the evil cult. And a lot of the stuff is very, very stylized and moody, and there's just a heavy atmosphere to it. And then the sequel basically picks up. Number one, I think it was directed by somebody else, and it picks up where this movie leaves off. But then you follow a whole new group of characters who are trying to deal with the Brigitte Lin Bride with White Hair character, who's now like the big evil that's terrorizing the martial landscape. And there's a flower that blooms once every, was it every 10 years or every 100 years? I can't remember. But the protagonist has to sit there and guard it until it blooms. And, that's sort of the thing that starts at the beginning of the first movie, and then you sort of see at the end of the second movie.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the second movie, I have to say I basically really didn't like the second movie. It was like, for so many reasons. There were a few redeeming parts to it, but in the end, I just really, really disliked it. And
was this your first time seeing the sequel, by the way, or was this your second time?
Yeah, so I had never watched the sequel before.
Okay.
And so I watched it. And incidentally, I got to point out, I'm not sure. I wasn't paying too close attention to the original language. Despite what I just said about being able to understand it, I do have to point out that I learned Chinese as a second language, and so it's easy for me to misunderstand stuff in movie dialogue when they're talking really fast and stuff. Okay. Especially if it doesn't have Chinese subtitles. And it's even worse if they're speaking Chinese and then there's English subtitles, because I'm like trying to listen to the Chinese and read the English at the same time.
Okay.
And anyway, the point is, I was very confused about when this movie actually picks up, because in the opening scenes, it almost makes it seem like it's happening very shortly after, and it's only later that it confirms it's been like 10 years since the ending of the previous movie.
I would agree with you that it's confusing. It's not 100% clear. At least for the subtitles, I was confused when I first watched it.
Yeah, exactly. And incidentally, man, the subtitles for this movie were really bad, at least the version that I watched on Amazon. So, I'm talking really bad.
I do want to say something. There's something I want to say about the audio and the subtitles, because I noticed it this time around. The version they have on Amazon has really, really good image quality. It looks like there's a Korean version that's really good visually, and I think it might be that one. I'm not 100% sure, but like a Korean DVD or a Korean Blu-ray. But the sound quality on the first one is really choppy on the one they have on at Amazon, I noticed. And it's not this, and I have a number of different versions of this on DVD and on Blu-ray. And the one that I usually watch has better sound quality but worse image quality. The image is a little bit more grainy and faded, but I find that the grainy faded look actually works better for this movie than because what do they call it? The soap opera effect? I forget. There's effect of the newer TVs, and Bride with White Hair really suffers from that when you watch it in HD. It loses some of the atmosphere that it's supposed to have. And so yeah, so they're definitely don't avoid watching these on Amazon, but just be aware that there might be some sound quality issues in the first one, and you're watching it in really bright HD, so it kind of gets a weird effect, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's actually a marked difference between quality between the first movie and the second movie that instantly jumped out to me. Like the second movie, I was like, wow, this looks like it's like a more modern movie or something. But that said, I felt it was like one of the key things that I disliked about this one was the extremely obvious use of the shaky camera fight scene thing. Like
which they did use
so
in the first
obvious.
one too. They did do that in the first one, but
the
direction was better. I think it was better direction.
Yeah, I think so. And in this one, it was almost every single fight scene was just. I'm like, am I watching a Hollywood movie or something where there's just no ability to actually have stunt coordination? Yeah. That was something that bugged me, and it makes it worse in the good quality because it's even more obvious that they're using that technique. And the music as well. There was a recurring theme that they would use, like a dramatic, like dun 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 dun, and they would play it over and over and over again in all the dramatic fight scenes. And then another thing, so this is a complete aside, but over the past couple months, I've been on YouTube binging this channel. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called, the channel is called Screen Rant, and they have a segment called Pitch Meetings, and the guy will,
I've seen those. Okay,
so I've been binging those, and it's just really got me thinking in his way of talking about movies, where it's like he'll just point out the obvious flaws of the movie in a funny way. And in this movie, it was like every single thing that happened, I was asking myself, why are they doing this? Or why didn't they do this other thing? It just seems so ridiculously contrived. And again, I'm not saying that all movies have to be like super like perfect or something, but this, to me, there was just so much stuff that happened that I thought didn't make sense that for me it kind of ruined.
Okay. Yeah, I'm usually pretty forgiving of like plot hole stuff unless it really leaps out at me. I'll have to admit though, in this movie, the plot holes didn't, like if you mention them, I'll be like, yeah, that makes sense what you're saying, but they didn't leap out at me. My reaction to this movie is I enjoy this movie. It's a fun wuxia film with a group of characters that feel like, I don't know, like you pluck them out of the Zhang Hu type thing. And, it's a good example of what Zhang Hu characters might look like. I like getting to see the second half of where the story has to go from the first movie. But it's just not as good as the first film. The first film is very, the lovemaking scene aside, it's really like just efficiently paced. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of got like a Back to the Future type thing where it's really hard to find a scene that they could remove and the movie wouldn't crumble. Do you know what I mean? And it just keeps getting from point A to point B as it needs to. And this movie it feels like it has a lot more room to breathe, and some of that room creates lower quality film in the end. Do you know what I mean? It's still fun and entertaining. It just doesn't rise to the level of the first movie at all, in my opinion.
For me, I felt like the pacing was really off. And so again, or I don't think I mentioned this, I had literally no expectations going into it. I didn't even know what it was about. I'd never read a review. You hadn't even mentioned anything other than, oh, it's Bride with White Hair too. I was like, cool. I didn't watch a preview or anything. So I go in, I'm watching the movie, and it's like showing Bride with White Hair, and then he's on the mountain with the flower. I'm like, this is going to be awesome. Then it shifts to like a comedy wedding movie for a while. Then all of a sudden people are dying, and then it turns into like a quest movie. Then it turns into a heist movie, and it took me a good 15 to 20 minutes. And I'm like, wait a second, I get what's going on here. So they had enough money to pay Leslie Chung for like 2 scenes, and then the rest of the movie is going to everybody else. And then finally it gets to the end, and we sort of resolve the story between the two. That part I thought was really good. I almost just kind of wish that they had just done a little summary and then like skipped to that part, because I felt like it would be better. I understand it would have lacked a lot of the impact of how they ended up in that situation, but the pacing was just all off, as opposed to the first one, which was a little bit lighthearted at the beginning, but I would say for the most part pretty dark throughout.
Yeah, even the lighthearted scenes are like, everything feels cohesive in the first movie, and the second movie everything like you were saying, it's like I enjoy being able to go to a film and watch like 8 different types of movies, so that's kind of why part 2 appeals to me in some ways, but it definitely makes something that's just a lot more patchwork feeling. And also the fact that you get introduced to Leslie Chung again, but you suddenly have to shift focus to these new characters that you've never met before. When you have it's sort of like you came to the movie because of Leslie Chung and Brigitte Lin, and so why would you suddenly want to watch new characters? And you kind of have to get over that the whole first part of the movie, and that's, I think that's something that really, like in sequels, that's like just a big misstep. Do you know what I mean? It can really, because you're banking on people liking the new characters, and
yeah.
So it's
and then you find out. Sorry, major spoilers here. If you want to, you can skip ahead 2 minutes or something. But basically, then you essentially find out that the main character and the gang of friends are extras in a horror movie, basically, because they all die, and you kind of do get invested in some of their characters, and they die. But to me, it wasn't the kind of thing where like I got invested and then I was like, oh man, I can't believe they died. It was more like, why did you make me get invested in this character when it was clearly just going to be like cannon fodder or something like that?
Okay. There was one death in there I remember being somewhat moving, but the other ones were kind of.
That said, though, one good aspect of it, I don't want to just trash the movie. One good aspect that we kind of mentioned in our email was how there's kind of like this party of heroes, and that is definitely a good crossover when you're talking about games, because a lot of times wuxia movies are not about that, which I imagine could make it hard for a group trying to run a wuxia campaign, and they're watching these movies, and there's never ever really like the party of heroes. As opposed to this one, it really did have that, a group of kind of diverse people with unique characteristics and fighting styles and whatever that all sort of works together. And I think there's even one dramatic entrance scene where like they're all teamed up, and that was pretty cool.
Well, and I think that was actually one of the big reasons why I wanted to do these 2 movies, because like he was saying, the second movie, it's like a party of characters that you could easily see this would be a campaign or an adventure in a typical RPG. The first movie would be really hard to pull off as an RPG. And I think this is something that a lot of people have trouble with when they try to run wuxia. Sometimes they treat wuxia a little differently than they treat other source material when they're trying to turn it into gameable content. And by that I mean a lot of people get this idea in their head that it has to 100% match the books. Do you know what I mean? Or 100% match the movies. But we don't ever do that with like fantasy RPGs or crime RPGs. Do you know what I mean? We give them more room to sort of accept that this is a game and there are going to be certain game conceits present. Do you know what I mean? And so the thing I like about the second movie as an idea for a campaign or an adventure is it's a situation. It's you can sort of picture a map where you have the bride's man-hating cult, and she's at war with the remnants of Wudang, and the players are these young initiates of Wudang, and that would make a really great campaign. It doesn't make for a 5-star movie, but it makes for a really solid campaign foundation where what the players do, where they decide to go, how they decide to take on this enemy could go in all kinds of different directions, and the GM wouldn't have to force anything on them to make it interesting. Whereas if you tried to do the first movie, you can do it without railroading, but I think most GMs who watch that film are going to be inclined to railroad it if they try to turn it into an adventure. And that's something that we talked a lot about when we wanted to bring wuxia to the gaming table, but we wanted to do it in a way that, allowed, player agency to remain intact and things like that. And so yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, but
yeah, well, I totally agree that I think the second movie is I mean, you could take the movie and take all the elements, like you said, and turn that into a campaign super easy. It's essentially, a sect war with some grudges thrown in and a heist built into it, and then a showdown. Another interesting aspect that correlates to our game is that we, especially with the adventures we put into the rule book, we, in some cases, intentionally have bad guys that are probably going to be way higher level than the main characters, to the point where the main characters probably could not beat them, which is exactly what happens in the movie. And in the movie, essentially, they have to get help from somebody else to win in the end. And we kind of have that element in there because I don't think this is the only Wuxia movie where it's like that. The heroes are not necessarily always going to be evenly matched up, and as opposed to maybe your typical Dungeons and Dragons module where you're anticipating a villain showdown in the end with a big fight. That might not necessarily be what you want with the Wuxia adventure.
Well, I think we have an adventure in the book where we even say like the characters will need to form alliances in order to get through this. And also to get back to the first movie, I think if you did want to game it, based on my experience, maybe you'll have different experience than me, but if I saw this movie and was like, I need to have this in my game, what I've realized is with storylines like that, you have to wait for them to kind of start happening on their own before you can really bring in any kind of stuff that would be inspired by this kind of storyline. Like I had a campaign where the players went to a temple that was it was like where these nuns had this sword artifact that they wanted, and it was kind of like the Heaven Sword Dragon Saber type thing. Do you know what I mean? So they had like the Heaven Sword basically, and one of the players befriended one of the nuns, and then he initiated a romance with her, and then eventually that led to this massive conflict because the nun had left the sect for this guy and brought the sword to them, and it eventually brought us to sort of Bride with White Hair type territory. That character actually became my version of the white-haired bride in the rulebook that I made for Ogregate. But so I think the key is to kind of realize that there are opportunities for this kind of development in a game, but be very wary of sort of making it happen. Do you know what I mean? Just so you want things to you want this kind of story to unfold a bit organically, I think, in an RPG.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, if a game master went in with the idea of like, okay, I want to recreate Bride with White Hair, or at least get something really close to that, I think it would be too hard. And the only way it might work would be if the players were sort of like side characters as that thing played out, and then maybe they could interfere, but it wouldn't work if they were the main characters and you just tried to make it happen. But I think what you just said is spot on, and this is a perfect kind of movie where game master can watch it, and however your style is, if you keep notes or if you do everything mentally, just have that in your mind for a scenario like you talked about. And one of the key things of the movie that I think is important is the misunderstanding. And to some extent it's a misunderstanding, to some extent it's not. It's
very Bluebeard. It's a very Bluebeard type thing where it's like, don't go in, you can go anywhere in the house but this room. And if you go in that room, we're going to have, it's that kind of a thing where she's like, there's one thing that really drives me crazy, and if you do that, I don't know what I'll do. And that's kind of how it ends up.
So maybe in a game that would be a bit heavy-handed, but getting involved in having the players get involved in a romance that turns bad is a great thing to pull from this movie. And actually, this comes to something I wanted to talk about and something I wanted to ask you about, because to some extent, romance plays kind of a big role in the game that we created. Not in the sense that there's like a game mechanic, but we created a very large cast of characters, and there are a lot of romantic connections between them. And so I wanted to ask your experience having romance in games, how you envision it playing out here, and I have a backup question, a secondary question about romance that I'll get to once you give me your initial thoughts.
So number one, when this book comes out, people will see there are a lot of romantic storylines in some of the NPCs, and most of those are probably from my end, because I tend to be very romantically minded when I write stuff, especially with Wuxia. I like Wuxia movies that have romantic plots to them, and I wanted to bring that into the game. And it's probably good that Jeremy was there to sort of stay my hand sometimes and make sure I wasn't doing it constantly. But
I think there was a certain point when I emailed you and I was like, you know what? I think all of our characters have romantic storyline. Maybe we should throw in some different ones.
Yeah, and he said it early enough too that we were able to kind of steer the. I think we got just enough based on when you made that.
Yeah, well, because at that point we were both creating characters simultaneously, and I remember I had thrown in some as well, so it wasn't just you; it was both of us.
But I mean, I think I definitely was more guilty of it than you were. So I'm sorry. What was your question again? I want to make sure I answer.
Just your experience with having romance in Wuxia games specifically, and also how you kind of envision it being used in the game that we made.
Yeah, I mean, I've used it for sure, just like in the example I mentioned, and I totally allow it. So I had that campaign, which was the very first Ogre Gate campaign, actually, and it was Bill's character who fell in love with the high ping nun. And they didn't actually have like a bad romance. It was fine. It's just that like Lady Whiteblade came and killed him, and and sent the other character off on a rage. But I also had a character who started a sect and ended up marrying kind of out of political convenience with like the daughter of another sect leader. Do you know what I mean? And then in another campaign we had similar types of things happen, and I had 2 player characters that I think ended up as a couple in the game. But the thing is, I think you do have to be careful with it. It's not something where like, we don't have like any mechanics in there for, how you should be careful, but just as a general thing, I think you have to know everybody's comfort level. I always, number one, anything sexual would obviously be off camera. Do you know what I mean? And you don't want to force romantic storylines onto players, unless they've expressed an interest in them, I think, or unless they've initiated them somehow, because that can feel very awkward for people if they're put on the spot like that, or if they just are uncomfortable with it. So I think you have to feel the room, you have to know your players, and some groups have no interest in romance, and that's fine. You don't need to pursue it. Some groups will have an interest in it, and I think even if they're not engaging in it, you might have characters around them that are married or whatever, or have some kind of romantic drama. But the one thing that I will say is, when you have a campaign that goes on long enough, so if you have a very long-term campaign, I think that's when romance almost kind of just starts coming up on its own without really any reason for, like the GM doesn't need to introduce it, the players don't need to introduce it, because the player characters will start getting older, and they'll start just thinking of other goals aside from, whatever it is they were pursuing early in their career. So in one of the campaigns where a character got married, it was because he had achieved all the things in the Zhanghu that you want to achieve. And he was like, and now I need to have like a family or something to carry on my legacy. Do you know what I mean? So it was that sort of a thing. And I think when you're the GM in those kind of circumstances, you have to be very, very fair in how you adjudicate it. You can't just say, oh, here's an opportunity for me to give him like a really tricky spouse who's going to backstab him at every turn. You have to, like, the way that I would tend to do it is I would in this campaign, the way that it worked is it was, again, a little bit more political. So the marriages were kind of, okay, here are some people I know would make appropriate matches for me, the sect leader of this organization. And so I tried to create, or if they were in the setting already, I tried to, sort of establish, like I basically tried to give the player a chance to figure out who these people were and form a rational judgment about whether they would make a good spouse or not. Do you know what I mean? And so I think you just have to, again, adjudicate it fairly, and you have to be, you have to know if you have characters that are romantically involved with NPCs, you have to know those NPCs' motivations really well, so that nothing that you do with them seems contrived. It's all got to kind of flow from the character. Do you know what I mean? If you do have a wife that betrays a husband, or a husband that betrays a wife, it should make sense. It shouldn't just be there because you wanted a betrayal plot beat. So I don't know. Does that answer the question, or is that
Yeah,
yeah,
and I mean we have plenty of stuff built into the game um, to accommodate for pretty much any scenario. I think like I mean for instance like, one of the things that a character could start out with as a social resource is devoted ex-lovers. So if you
yeah,
wanted to have a character who was kind of either a playboy or maybe just having a string of relationships, you could start that way. We
yeah,
also have plenty of NPCs who are like we have sort of a seductress character that's in there. We have a person who easily falls in love, and so if the GM is using the characters we provided, it would be super easy to work that in. Um, anyway, I had a follow up. So to my follow up question, this kind of touches on a number of different points, but uh, one of the things that we talked about as we were over the years that we were making this game is different role playing styles and whatever.
yeah,
And obviously, anybody who's even remotely involved in the role playing game scene knows about the wild success of Dungeons and Dragons Fifth Edition, and some people may or may not be aware of the Mercer effect because Matt Mercer is this really famous and popular GM, and he has his own style, and he's a voice actor, so he can bring something to the GM thing that a lot of GMs probably couldn't. And so I'm curious your thoughts about that in terms of romance. Because so I've played in your games with you as the GM,
yeah.
and I know your style, and you do role playing, but you're not like doing voices and
Yeah,
all
I'm
that
not. I'm
different
not.
stuff.
I'm not a big voice. You know why? Because one time I tried to do I think it was an Italian priest in a mafia campaign for my Crime Network game, and everybody thought I was doing an Irish accent, and I was like, okay, I am not built for this. Also, I kind of get annoyed at the voices thing. Like, I don't mind people getting excited and into the character. I think that's fun, but sometimes I feel like it's too much acting sometimes for my taste. You know what I mean? I think there's a level of acting in RPGs where I'm like, and again, this is just total personal preference. I'm not trying to crap on people who like acting, but I feel like we've now kind of entered into LARPing territory if we're going to be acting this much. And so, yeah. So,
Like
anyways,
a
go
lot of it
on.
has to do a lot of it I think has to do with the group because I mean like for example with Critical Role they're all voice actors
Yeah.
and they're performing, so that's different. But if you're at the table with your friends, if all the friends are into it and all the friends are kind of doing it, fine. But I'll give you an example from real life. So I'm part of a fifth edition campaign right now, and I decided I was going to try it. I was like, I'm going to try. I'm playing a noble,
Mm.
and so I'm doing a British accent to go along with this noble, and it's actually working pretty well. But it's a little weird because I'm the only one at the table doing an accent,
Okay.
and so like everybody else is just being like, okay, my character says that he wants some beer or something, and then I'm
Yeah.
coming in trying to do an accent. It's a little bit odd. Anyway, I get what you're saying. Let me make I never got to my second point though. So what I wanted to ask you about specifically was how you handle role playing romance when you're the NPC and then you have a person at the table who is interacting with that NPC. Because I've had situations. The reason I brought up the Matt Mercer thing is because he does it in his games in which he will become a woman and then he's interacting and flirting with somebody.
Okay.
And I had a situation once where I was DMing and like my players wanted to flirt with these girls or something, and I started to role play the girls, and then all of a sudden I'm like flirting with my
Yeah.
friend, and I was like, all right, forget it, I'm not role playing this. I'm just gonna tell you
Yeah,
what
it's
happened.
it's awkward. I get that. So number one, I don't do like the female voice or anything like that if I'm doing it. So I don't really, I probably don't run into the same level of discomfort that you might if you're, do you know what I mean, trying to play the character like that. But I I don't know. I mean, I think it varies. It really depends on the situation. Like everybody has a level of discomfort with that sort of thing, depending on where, you know what I mean? At a certain point, everybody's going to get uncomfortable. And so I interact as much in character as I'm comfortable acting. And then I switch to second person or third person or whatever. Sorry. Yeah. Third person. And you know, I don't know. I play it by ear. I used to be very adamant that I was always speaking in first person in games, but then the more I thought about it, the more I was honest about how I play, I shift in and out depending on comfort level. And I think that's kind of how that is a handy tool for, okay, I'm not really comfortable flirting with this player character because this is somebody I know in other contexts and it just feels weird. So I'm going to shift to third person now. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's fine for romance. Do you know what I mean? Especially for NPCs, because you can say, oh yeah, she lowers her head and looks bashful, or she seems a little bit put off by your comment, or whatever it is. You can, you don't, you can speak about it in third person, and I think the key is to do as much as you're comfortable with, and then that's all you need to do. And obviously, if somebody is crossing a line, you got to tell them. Do you know what I mean? Like that's another thing. I also just wanted to say about voices. I will say I was in Rob Conley's game, and he does Majestic Wildlands and stuff like that, and he's a really great GM, and he does voices, and he does them in a way that I find entertaining and works. So I think in the hands of the right GM, it can be fine. But I find it very exhausting to have to do them myself. I've tried to do them, and it just kind of tires me out.
Yeah, I think it just depends on place as a GM. You got to play to your skill set, and I'll finish out the romance thing by just saying that I think, in addition to everything you said, which I agree with, I think that it's important for the GM and the players to all be on the same page before you actually start rolling the dice. In other words, obviously, if you have an established group, you don't need to do that. But if you're getting a bunch of people together, let's play a Wuxia game, there should be a session 0 probably where you sit down and kind of say, what are the expectations?
Yeah.
And everybody's on the same page. Because we do have some big NPCs, even ones that are in the adventures we provide, who would be very likely, I think, to be inclined to interact romantically with a player if that was the direction the GM and the players were interested in going. But as long as everybody's on the same page, and that needs to happen before the situation arises, ideally. Yeah,
no, that's definitely the case. I mean, there are characters in the game that could be used in that way. You don't have to, though. Like, even some of the most romantic characters, they could still just serve as a romantic backdrop more than anything else. But you can definitely... those arrows can be pointed at player characters if the player characters are open to it. So what... I think the next topic that we were going to discuss after romance was magic, because that does come up in this movie. And obviously magic is a tricky one in Wuxia, because movies are a little different than books, it seems. Like, the movies have sort of followed their own evolution versus the evolution of the books, and both have kind of had different levels of magic at different points, right? But generally speaking, Wuxia is kind of low magic, right? It's generally... any of the magic that exists is usually related to martial arts principles. It's not even really magical. It's more, this is a martial arts principle that actually works when you apply it correctly. And so that is the conceit that allows for superhuman feats and stuff. But you will see some really, things that really bend our expectations of physics and things like that. So I guess number one, what's your feeling about the use of magic in Bride with White Hair? And number two, we can talk about, the game itself and how we approach magic.
I mean, I felt that it was so sort of, in my opinion at least, sort of like seamlessly woven into the action and the plot, that it didn't jump out as being odd to me in any way. And I think that this is exactly why we included a little skill called magical arts. We didn't want to get into super magic, cultivation, casting spells and rituals and all that stuff, just because we were aiming for a more grounded Wuxia that doesn't have that stuff. But we did include an option to add a little bit of that flavor, and that's exactly why. We didn't want it to have it be a super big thing, but for those characters who want to maybe have some kind of curse or some kind of divination or something, that we do allow for that. What specific scenes were you thinking about in the first one that jumped out to you?
Well, I mean, like the evil cult body shifting scene, where the man becomes a woman, and then I think vice versa. And then there's also and again, this is maybe not quite, like, that was clearly magic. That was some kind of magical thing, or maybe possibly sleight of hand in some way. Like, maybe it was magic as we would understand it, like a stage magic thing put on for, the benefit of the people that were present. I don't know. But so I guess that's another possibility. But also the sect leaders seem to be able to get people to to perceive what he or she wanted them to perceive. So like at one point the sect leader is masquerading as the leader of Wudong when he's talking to Leslie Chung's character, and I think that there must have been a couple of other little bits of magic sprinkled in here or there, but I feel like it's really that body shifting scene that always stands out to me as, oh, okay, this movie has magic in it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's hard to, I mean, especially with movies, it's sometimes hard to figure out where the line is between what are they doing that's fancy martial arts stuff and what are they doing that goes beyond that. And I think when you bring that into a game, the key is, again, kind of what I talked about before in terms of the agreement between the players, and also the fact that you can, if you're emulating a movie and everybody's on the same page, then that's pretty easy. We talked about this, I'm pretty sure, last time about the genre physics. That's essentially what we're talking about in our genre physics section, is how much magic do you want, how much over the top stuff, how much romance do you want. All that stuff kind of plays into the setting that you're playing in.
Well, yeah, because are you doing Buddha's palm and the bastard swordsman, or are you doing one-armed swordsman and Come Drink With Me? Those are very different styles of wuxia.
Another thing that plays into it, in my opinion, is that I feel like the filmmaking technology and special effects technology has a lot to do with this. The early TV shows and movies of the classic wuxia novels, whether you're talking about Condor Heroes or whatever, I feel like they're pretty down to earth. But then you get into I would say the maybe 2000s and stuff, they start getting really fantastic.
They do.
And it's hard to tell when you read the novels what Jin Yong envisioned, but because there's definitely some very fantastic things that happen. And it's not until I feel like they got into CGI that all of a sudden they have dragons flying through the air and that stuff.
A couple of points. So number one, that's actually a lot more complicated, though, than people think, the history of that. Because if you go back even further, you go back, the movies that we think of as early wuxia, like Come Drink With Me and The Temple of the Red Lotus, those were a new wave of martial arts movies that were intended to be more grounded, right? And before that, if you look at a lot of the martial arts movies that were coming out, that were in black and white and stuff, they had a lot of magic in them. Do you know what I mean? And again, I'm not as familiar with those movies, but I've seen enough clips of them, and I'm familiar with some of them, that you see more magic kind of sprinkled into them than you do in those like Shaw Brothers, new wuxia films from the 60s. So I feel like we've kind of also absorbed a narrative that might not be 100% accurate. And I think like the more important thing is kind of what you were saying, with it really boils down to what were the authors intending when they write about this stuff. And some of the scenes in like a Condor Heroes or something, if you imagine them a certain way, they do come across as having a more magnificent effect. I feel like, though, if you're in a Gulong book, it's more like James Bond, where you'll get something fantastical, but it'll actually have a really logical explanation for why it functions the way it does. And so you might get something that on first glance you think is some kind of super powerful weapon, but in actuality it's just like a really ingenious mechanical device or something like that. And I think a good movie that you could sort of hold up as crossing the line in a big way is Web of Death, which is interesting because it sort of takes Heaven Sword, Dragon Saber, and a few other Condor Heroes sections, and I think a little bit of Gulong, and sort of blends them together, but throws in a lot of fantastical elements. So I don't.
Interesting.
Go ahead.
Whenever I think about the magic stuff, is I always think of, make sure I get them right, because I sometimes get Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Water Margin switched up. It's definitely Water Margin. So one of the characters in Water Margin, or Outlaws of the Marsh, whichever you translate the title as, I believe he's described as a sorcerer. I can't remember his name, but he literally will, like, if I remember correctly, and it's been years, but in the novel, he will like summon storms and things like that. So it's clearly like magical in the sense of like wizards and sorcery. So like that kind of stuff obviously has been in the Chinese, realm of thought in terms of entertainment for like a really, really long time. And the question for me is, Oh, and then that's not even getting into the whole Taoism thing with,
Yeah.
exorcising demons and whatever different stuff. So my question is, I'll give you an example, which is, let's say in Chinese it's Xianglong Shibazhang, the 19 Shibazhang, 18 dragons subduing palms from Condor Heroes. It's in both of them because
Yeah.
Guo Jing learns it, and then I'm pretty sure Yang Qi, I think they both learn it. But anyway, the point is like, I vividly remember having watched, I'm pretty sure I forget, there's so many versions. I'm getting confused thinking about this off the top of my head. But the older version of the Condor Heroes TV show, which I had seen, was pretty mundane in terms of the effects. And then the one that came out with Liu Yifei, I'm pretty sure, Guo Jing uses the 18 dragons doing palms in one of the early scenes, and it's like there's literally like dragons flying through the air, and I was like, whoa! Like at the time, I thought it was super, super, super cool. But then that's kind of what I'm getting at. The question is, what was the author intending, and what do the players and the GM, in terms of the game, like what are they envisioning that as? When they envision the attacks that we created, like they're pretty fantastic, but we don't intend them to be magical. Like we have yin yang stuff and 5 element stuff, but in our game, those are intended to just be martial arts stuff, not magic. But I can see how there is kind of a gray line between those.
Well, I think the thing about I think that stuff, I do like that stuff, and obviously I incorporated some of it into Ogregate, so I like it a lot, clearly. But I think in terms of just how faithful that is, I think most of the time, just from memory, the Condor Hero stuff seems to be more like the dragons doing palm thing is much more energy based, right? It's not literally supposed to be dragons coming out of your hands, and and so I feel like what happened in, I forget which series it was, but it's like those series that came out in the 2000s. I think it was, like you were saying, the special effects driving things a little bit, and what maybe started out as a really stylized depiction of something that it just like in most of the versions I'd seen earlier, it was like you might see like smoke coming out of the guy's palm, or you might see like clearly they're having some kind of physical effect on the trees from a distance and things like that. But so I mean, it's obviously getting to a level that's beyond what we would think of as normal martial arts, but it's still rooted in these core martial arts principles that are present in a lot of wuxia fiction. So I don't know. I'm pretty. My feeling on it is this: you have to decide what the dial is for whatever campaign you're running, and obviously the default for Righteous Blood is going to be a lot more to the mundane level than than it might otherwise be. But we're mainly, the places that we allowed for magic were with special items, because those can easily be removed from the game. Do you know what I mean? More than the techniques. I don't think we have any overtly magical techniques. There might be one that's actually tagged with a magic parenthetical sort of marker. But I think we were definitely thinking more Gulong anyways. So, we really wanted to kind of keep things more rooted in the mundane. But what I will say is this: everything in a game like this, and everything in a campaign when you're a GM, has upsides and downsides. So if you decide to allow for a lot of magic, if you decide to allow for a lot of like monsters and creatures, one thing that does for you is it immediately opens up all these doors that would be closed for adventure purposes. So, I think it's when we were playtesting this game, I found it perfectly easy to run a campaign without magic. It's not an issue, and I think it can be done. But it is more of a challenge than if you had magic in it. So there is that added level of challenge that results from not having the higher levels of magic or the monsters or whatever. So it's just something to be aware of. Throughout the process of making this game, everything we did was a choice, and we always saw like every choice has good sides and bad sides, and you are trying to make the choices that make the most sense for the game. So I don't know. Did I go off on a tangent, or did I
No, I
address.
think that's great. And I'll add one final thing, which is that I think that shoot, I just lost my train of thought. What was I going to say? You were talking about magic, and I had one more thing I wanted to say. Oh, I know. So I did a poll on Twitter the other day. If anybody out there is listening, you can track me down, I'm sure, and find that. I asked my audience why they thought at the moment it seems like cultivation and Xianxia stuff, it seems to be a lot more popular than Wuxia, at least in the terms of the translated novels and the TV shows as well. Like a lot of the TV shows coming out of China, there's not a lot of super popular wuxia right now. It's all
and even the wuxia movies or the wuxia shows are throwing in a lot of Shansha stuff. Yeah.
And obviously, you know, my Twitter poll that had a few hundred people respond is not going to be like the ultimate explanation, but the vast majority of people responded that they liked the cultivation novels more because they're more fantastic.
Okay.
So I think that's a factor, but on the other hand, and I know there's Xianxia cultivation role-playing games out there, I think that pulling that off in a role-playing game is a lot harder, because to truly emulate that, the levels of magic need to go way beyond reality, and building that into a mechanical structure for a role-playing game is going to be hard.
I ran into that problem big time with Ogregate, because I initially wanted to make which I'm still going to do, but I had an idea for a supplement where the foundations of the game sort of allow for Shansha-like levels much higher up, but I didn't expand on it. And so I started working on expanding on it, and I realized I could get to like Zoo of Magic Mountain level, but getting up to those Shansha levels where they're like cosmic scale it was really, I didn't even want to think about it. Do you know what I mean? Just because it's like, I don't know, maybe you can give people a visual example to explain to them like just how massive Shansha scales can get compared to a regular fantasy RPG even.
I mean, for people who are not familiar, they're going to be like blown away. I mean, so just to put it into context, I had an artist create a depiction of something from one of the novels I'm translating, and this depiction comes from only something like a couple hundred chapters into a story that's like 1600 chapters, and essentially the main character starts out on a planet, but it's not even a planet, it's a continent, which is, imagine like a flat earth kind of thing, that's the remnant of a shattered planet, but that's part of another system, that's part of another system, part of another system. And then the depiction I have is something called the Central Planetary River, where the main character and his friend kind of arrive, and they see what is essentially like millions of planets and around a central, like kind of a sun, but it's not a sun, it's a collection of thousands of planets that shine brightly. And this is the only level this is only chapter like 300. It goes on to the point where, you know, characters can literally destroy essentially what I would say are solar systems and then galaxies with one hit. So it's exactly what you say, how to create something that's a game system that takes care, because usually in these novels, the characters start out at level 1 as like an ordinary mortal. So how to go from that to the cosmic scale, and it's even beyond the cosmic scale, to be honest. I've thought about it a lot too, and it kind of blows my mind.
I mean, you could definitely do it. I just feel like it would be like, it's not the kind of system that I'm generally inclined to make, which would be a much more tiered system. Like, you know, there's like the mundane level 1 world, and there's like the next level, and then like you just kind of have these not like discrete levels like you would think of in a normal game, but just more like these are the different scales of power that exist in the world.
And it's not as if no one's ever done anything like this. I mean, like, one thing that struck me initially when I was getting into Call of Cthulhu is how they have gods and stuff. They're just immensely powerful. Or I know that Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition just released a book about gods and stuff. I haven't even looked at it, so I don't know how they handled it. And I know that, like I mentioned, there are some people who have put together cultivation or Xianxia kind of stuff, but I don't know. I still think that there has yet to be something that really nails it the way that I would like to see it.
Well, and again, I'm getting a little off topic here, but I think that's one of the perpetual problems of wuxia and any niche genre in general for gaming, which is like you and I forget when we met. It must have been like 3 years ago at this point or something. But was it 2017?
It's more, no, because actually we met before my son was born, and he's now almost 5.
Oh, well, okay, so time's flown. So, but the point I was going to make is, prior to that, we had been off in our own little private worlds, just, being fans of this stuff on our own, in our own way. And by the time we met, we had totally different points of view on, why we were there and what we wanted and what would make for a good game or a bad game and all that. And so one of the things that you run into when you put out a game like this, or when you go on, when you're a fan of games like this and you're looking for games to buy, is that it's really hard to connect the game to that very particular set of sensibilities that any one person has. And I don't know how you really get around that. I think the ideal situation is the more games are out there, the better. Because when I was before I was making games and when I was just trying to run Wuxia games, what I was always wanting was just to have more Wuxia games available so that I could take bits and pieces from different ones and make my ultimate sort of experience of a campaign. But in terms of Shansha, I managed to get up to like essentially an Ogre Gate level 100 with some of my deities. But the problem is it just didn't match the Shansha scaling. I can do more like a Journey to the West type of level of power than a Shansha type level of power in my game.
To be perfectly honest, I suspect that the number of, I mean, this is just pure speculation, but I have the feeling that the number of people who are into tabletop role-playing games, but at the same time have actually read a lot of that high-level stuff, I suspect that number is very, very low, because whenever I run into people talking about like the Sanxia cultivation stuff in the context of tabletop role-playing games, I think a lot of those people don't even know the difference between Wuxia and Sanxia, and they think that Sanxia is just like people flying on swords, maybe, and like they shoot like beams of light, but it's definitely way beyond that.
It took me a while to wrap my head around Shansha. I remember when my first encounter with it was I was a fan of Wuxia television series, and there were these ongoing sort of debates among fans about the rising level of magic in Wuxia series, and so the term that started getting using was they're doing too much Shansha. And so it just became a synonym in a lot of conversations for magic, essentially. The magical side of Wuxia, or this is magic beyond Wuxia. Anything beyond, using shooting like chi energy out of your palm or something would have been considered Shansha by a lot of people in the conversation. So
I totally agree. And for anybody who's listened to this point that wants more information about that, my YouTube channel is, youtube.com/deathblade, and I have a bunch of videos talking about what are these things, how they are portrayed in the novels, and blah, 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 all that stuff.
And you also have a handy guide, too, I think, at the website that you're translating at, the Wuxia World website. Which is it's a very useful overview of the different genres. So I guess another topic that we should be discussing here, we're probably going to have to cut it a little bit short because we've already been going for an hour, so we probably won't get to every topic we wanted to cover. But the overall darkness level of this movie, the first movie in particular, obviously the second movie is visually dark, but it has a lot of humor in it that kind of disrupts the atmosphere. The first film, when I was listening to the music this time around, I noticed it really reminds me of the opening music to the original Terminator movie, because it's got that percussive beat in the background, and it has this kind of martial theme melodically. It's not the same as the Terminator drum or the Terminator melody, but it's got that same level of darkness to it, I felt. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but that was something that I really picked up on right away this time, was the music at the very start. I felt like maybe they were deliberately trying to emulate the Terminator with that. But it was just speculation.
I will respond, but before I do, I just want to point out that this is being recorded during COVID-19 lockdown, and we're all, like, my son is here 24/7. I can hear him kind of like yelling and screaming in the background, so sorry about that, but you can blame it on the virus. to go into answering your question, I that didn't even occur to me, that music stuff. I know you're like a musician and are a lot more in tune with that, so I didn't even consider that, so I'm not going to comment on it. But what I will say is that I think so. Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades is being billed as Dark Wuxia, and I think this is really like one of the perfect examples for what we intended in terms of calling it Dark Wuxia, because as for example, the lethality of the combat, that's in there as well in Bride with White Hair. Actually, 1 and 2, I would say. It's characters a lot of times are getting killed with 2 hits, and that's kind of how we wanted it to be. Not a thing where they're going back and forth with their swords clashing forever, but more like if you're not on top of your game, you're going to get killed, and that comes across pretty well, I would say, in both.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's even characters like very important characters get cut in half with a whip, with one strike of a whip. It's there's a lot of people getting cut in half. So yeah,
and then in addition to that, just the whole general. I mean, it's a tragedy essentially. This movie, and while a lot of wuxia is super heroic to some extent, we drew inspiration from many movies in which it's not as rosy of a depiction of that martial world.
I think we were going for, again, like we weren't basing it totally on Gulong, but we were going for more of that Gulong mood where you sort of expect, like the movies that I was thinking of when I watched this were ones that, number one, were dark, and number two, had a really memorable emotional beat at the end that was downcast, not upcast, and so this is definitely an example of both those things where it's visually dark, just in terms of atmosphere. It's dark in terms of what violence means in the setting. It's dark in terms of what they're saying about human nature. Like just even like the good guys aren't even all that good, really, in this movie. Do you know what I mean? They're not as good as they would be in a lot of other wuxia movies. And also it's all against the backdrop of this terrible betrayal that that this historical general commits. So it's against this. There's also this historical sort of tragedy unfolding in the background against all of it. So yeah, oh, go ahead.
I'm just saying the 2 adventures that we have in there, I think we did a pretty good job of trying to bring that feeling into it. And whether it's the circumstances leading up to the characters or the player characters being involved in this adventure, or even just the various things that befall them or could befall them as they go through the adventures without getting into any spoilers, I could totally see the adventures we created, depending on how the players interact with them, being a movie just like this.
Yeah, we're definitely going for that style with it. So yeah, I think this is definitely a I know we have a list of essential viewings, and I think we put this on that list. I'm pretty sure. If not, it's on the other list of movies. We have like a couple of viewing recommendations and reading recommendations, and
a couple. I think we have over 50 movie recommendations.
But what I mean is we have 3 different viewing and movie recommendation sections in the book.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we did include this one as on that list.
Yeah. So definitely the darkness, and I guess the other thing would be the Grudges, which we'll probably get into with other movies in more depth. But this and the next film are all about the grudges that are just sort of driving a lot of the drama in the martial world. And I think that that's something that we really wanted to bring into the game. We brought it to a more personal level in our game. Our grudges did tend to be more personal. A lot of the alliances tend to be more personal, whereas this one is a little bit more focused on, it has the personal too, but it's more, you could sort of think of it just in terms of the sex, and you'll understand what's going on.
True. Although, in the first one, it is the personal vendetta of the villain that is driving them to, if I remember correctly, I think it said they took over the devil cult, as opposed to creating it. Might be wrong about that, but it was them getting kicked out of Wudang to begin with that created that grudge, and that literally was what drove the entire plot. And the second one obviously is continuing from the first one and the grudge that she develops and wants to end. And yeah, I would say that the last episode we talked about this a little as well. And in One-Armed Swordsman and Crippled Avengers, they had that. We're having in this one. I think this is one of those things that is really quintessential wuxia stuff. And I'm actually planning a video that I'm going to release hopefully in the next week talking about some of the key aspects of wuxia. And this is one of the ones where I think it's hard to find. I haven't done a vast research about it or vast thought about it, but I think it'll be hard to find a really good wuxia movie that doesn't have the element of revenge, which essentially is a grudge in it. It's just such a deep part of the genre.
I'm trying to think. So I know we had a conversation about this, and I'm trying to. The thing that was hard for me is I know that I've seen movies where I don't remember revenge being a part of them, or I don't, at least not a big part. But I'd have to go back and actually watch and make sure there wasn't some grudge that got thrown in that I missed, or do you know what I mean? But like the movies where I think you would tend not to see it would be ones like some of those earlier Cheng Pei films where there's a lot of Cheng Pei and another hero or two running away from the law and having to get from point A to point B. But maybe if you sat down and examined them, there would still be a grudge in there. I don't know that might but just off the top of my head. But I think it's either way. It's one of the most delicious ingredients in wuxia. I think that would be the and it's the kind of thing that it's sort of what seems to drive a lot of the more introspective thoughts in wuxia movies and in wuxia novels, where they sort of reflect on the cycle of grudges, and you have heroes that are trying to escape from this. So a lot of this movie, what happens in this movie is she decides to leave her sect for love. And he doesn't. That's really he doesn't actually, when they ask him to come and help them, he goes. And I feel like that's the real root of the tragedy in this is, she's willing to undergo that gauntlet of torment to get out of the sect. And he just goes and sort of does his duty. And those are the two crucial choices. But both of them are characters who they want to be together, but they're sort of stuck because of the grudges that exist and pervade the Jianghu. And so I don't know. I think it's one of the things that kind of it adds an emotional and a philosophical level sometimes to the movies and books.
Sure. I mean, and my take on it is that I felt a lot more sympathetic to her by far, because there was a key moment when she finally shows up, and basically the way I remember it is he's like, "Why did you do this?" And then she is like, "Do you trust me or not?" Now, if he had been like, "Fine, I trust you," she would have been like, "I didn't do it," and then she would have, it would have turned out totally differently. But in that moment, he didn't actually trust her, and he actually thought that she did it. And so in my mind, maybe she didn't necessarily need to massacre everybody, but at least she was being consistent,
Well, not just that, but you also got to think of again, it's sort of all like the massacre seems to come out of nowhere too, because it's a short movie, but like it's all this stuff that she's just experienced before she gets there is, I think, a big part of it too. And and like you're saying, it's that Bluebeard moment where, do you trust me? And he says the one thing that he's not supposed to say, that the audience has been told he's not supposed to say. And so, she definitely does overreact. But what is interesting to me is every time I watch it, I'm sort of with you where in my memory, she's always more villainous. But then when I watch the movie again, I'm like, well, she has a moment of villainy, but then like she's kind of instantly helping him again, and she's not really that ruthless. Do you know what I mean? It's just sort of like and I think that's another reason why the first movie's maybe a little better than the second movie too, because the second movie, this is more like the origin story, and the second movie is more like, okay, now you have the bride with white hair terrorizing everybody. So But yeah, so I don't know. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just saying I agree. And in the second one, she is, for the majority of the movie, the villain. I mean, she's really, not a good person for the most part.
Yeah, no, she's trying to slaughter Wudong, and she's like deeply, deeply opposed to any man that they come across, and also they're kind of like they're kidnapping people, and they're brainwashing them, and there's a lot of other stuff going on. So it's it's a much, and it's a little bit, again, this is spoilery, but the overall arc actually works because it's a redemption arc by the end of the movie. It's just that the way it's handled in the second movie sort of obscures that this is a very cohesive story that's being told. But anyways, is there anything else that we need to add or say?
I think we covered. I mean, we could probably keep going and bringing out little tidbits here and there, but I think we hit all of the most important stuff.
Okay, all right. So again, the movies we covered today were Bride with White Hair 1 and 2. These are both available on Prime, and so you can go there and you can check them out. You can also get them on DVD and Blu-ray. I believe you can still get them. I don't know. I have my copies, so I don't got to worry about it anymore. But I know that there's and again, I can't remember the name of the company, but there's a Korean Blu-ray that's really good, and I think I don't know if it was Tai Sung, but there's a standard one that's out there that's my preferred version to watch when I watch it. Again, though, the image quality on that one isn't quite as good as the Blu-ray. But I think in this case, you don't want the HD. I think the HD takes away from how the movie's meant to look. So it's like this is totally aside from the point, but I remember many years ago I saw Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade on my uncle's HD TV, and it totally ruined the experience. It's a great TV, but something about that movie being in HD, everything looked different and it didn't feel the same anymore. So, and I think this is one of those kind of movies. So I guess we'll head out. We'll be back on, and until then, we will talk to you later.
Comes a tide of emotion, killing joy, cutting steel across your eyes. Are you dead or insane as you stumble through the night, soothe the anguish and the pain with the soft taste of blood? Who will avenge you should you stray? Will you meet the appointed time? Will you return